So, Oriana, to start out, your piece is great. Congratulations, by the way. It's
Thank you.
It's an excellent, excellent work. I think probably the best way to sort of start our conversation is to maybe look at some of the broad themes of the piece. You basically depict 3 reasons why China's military might want to go global, develop expeditionary capabilities. Maybe walk us through that. Might be the best way to start.
Sure. So I put out 3 main ideas of the drivers that would push China in this direction: commercial, domestic, and international. I outlined trends that have already started that you can see by different statistics and indicators: the amount of companies that are overseas and their assets that are under threat, the amount of Chinese citizens traveling, living, working overseas, domestic public opinion about what the Chinese military role should be, as well as the international community asking for the Chinese military to expand their capabilities to contribute more to international missions, mostly humanitarian disaster relief. The big caveat for these drivers are sort of twofold. The first is that I'm not arguing that China has plans to be a global military. This is what I think is very unique about the piece, because it lays out the different factors that would push the party in that direction, even in spite of their current plans to focus more on regional contingencies or even internal development. And the second aspect is thinking differently about what an expeditionary force is. I think in the American mindset, when we think about a global military, we think about having bases around the world, conducting multiple operations at the same time, stationing troops. The Chinese presence is not going to be like that at all, but it doesn't mean, because we don't see China moving in the direction the United States did, that they won't have a global presence.
Okay, fair enough. So my second question for you is there's a lot of articles that are written in the National Interest, a lot of other publications talking about Chinese anti-access area denial capabilities, carrier killer missiles, cruise missiles, all that nature. Can China develop this capability while also focusing on those anti-access capabilities? Can it walk and chew gum at the same time, basically?
I think the simple answer to that is yes. Even if you take projections of GDP growth as being more modest, they have the funds, the resources, and the motivation, if you look at Xi Jinping's recent speech in November, to develop these global capabilities. Now, the regional contingencies are always going to be the priority. So it's not going to be the case that they're going to start diverting resources from some of the maritime offshore island disputes to be focusing on protecting commercial assets in Africa. But I think given their economic development right now, they should have no problem balancing those. And more importantly, given some of the domestic support that they have for these movements, the people will be supportive and understand if more money is being spent on these things. The big thing about the A2AD focus is that is not, I think, the ideal Chinese focus. If you look at all of their writings, it's more of a stopgap measure of what a weaker country can do, take advantage of some of the vulnerabilities of a stronger power. But all these writings that highlight the vulnerabilities immediately after highlight China's desire to have the same types of capabilities and the same types of assets. And so at a certain point, they'll get to the technological level in which they'll focus more, not only on the ability to impact other countries' operations, but the ability to operate themselves. And you can already see a shift in their rhetoric, in their doctrine, and their strategy going that direction. So obviously I think the capabilities and the training are soon to follow.
Okay. So to follow up on that, if we're looking at specific capabilities, get maybe a little bit more wonky on this scenario, is there any capabilities that you could see them developing? Like there's lots of talk about aircraft carriers, heavy lift. What specific capabilities do you think they'd need to maybe take this forward?
So the bottom line is the capabilities they need aren't as sexy as the ones that you just outlined. Most of what they need is airlift, sea lift, the ability to transport people and material from China somewhere else. China specialists who study the military and the development, when they hear this idea of expedition, right away they're skeptical. And that's because one of China's main limitations is mobility. They highlight on their television, every time there's an exercise, they will brag about the fact that they can move troops from one area of their country to another. My view is if you have to brag about that, it really highlights how immobile you actually are. So the ability to move people, move material is a big one, and then situational awareness. They don't have the C4ISR network. They don't have space assets and things that they need to not only operate, but just have a general awareness of where their operations are going to be, what their people are doing, and have command and control between different units. They are currently aspiring to be able to operate jointly. they can't do that yet, and the command and control and training for that is really important. So it's good that you asked that question because the obstacles seem huge. And for many military analysts, they seem insurmountable. But for someone that studied these issues for a while, I can highlight every couple of years the obstacles that we say were insurmountable. And also, not only technological obstacles, but in this case, ideological. China has never wanted to be, and currently I think is honest about saying they don't want to be a global power. They are against alliances as being sort of Cold War relics, and the idea of pursuing those types of relationships, basing arrangements, really goes against how China sees itself in the world. But that was the case about peacekeeping operations in the 1990s, and that changed very quickly when they redefined what their role was going to be. And so it would take a lot of investment, but you see some of those investments already in the Y-20, which is, transport aircraft. You see those investments already underway with, for example, their navigation system, the Beidou system, being completed in a couple of years. So they're already doing what they need to do to get there, and it seems to me that the different drivers I've laid out in the article will provide them with the adequate amount of motivation to actually accomplish this.
Okay, fair enough. So my final question for you is this. Looking out in the future, let's presuppose that China does start developing these capabilities. Does this create any type of security dilemma? I mean, we've already sort of there a little bit with the United States with A2AD and air-sea battle. If China starts developing these global expeditionary capabilities and maybe uses them in some predetermined scenario, maybe in the Middle East, maybe to protect Chinese citizens on the ground. I mean, we had the situation in Libya a couple of years back. Will other countries get nervous and seek to counter these capabilities? And what specifically can China do to sort of maybe smooth that over and reassure different countries?
So I don't have a good answer for you because I think it could go either way.
Okay.
And what we need to do is look at which indicators point us in which direction and keep our eyes open to see which direction it's going to go. On one hand, if China has these commercial, international, domestic interests that drive them to become more involved militarily abroad, and this is, expeditions that are very limited in scale in relatively permissive environments for the sake of protecting some of their people and their interests. If they move in that direction, it is possible that their interests will evolve along with that. For many years, the United States, along with many members of the international community, has tried to get China on board to be what we have termed sort of more responsible stakeholder, term that most of people in China don't like. But the idea is to engage in some burden sharing of the public goods. This is something that China has had no interest in, largely because their interests are a lot less than the United States in a lot of these areas. But as they start needing this ability to operate, to protect these increasing interests overseas, it's possible that their interests will shift, we'll have more convergence, more cooperation with the United States. I'm a little bit more pessimistic about that scenario. I think even though interests can converge, the problem in many cases in U.S.-China relations is not only conflict of interest, of which there will continue to be many, especially in terms of regional security issues, but we have different preferred tactics to accomplish our goals, which in many cases hinders cooperation. And even when we have the same goals, we have different priorities, which can also hinder cooperation. And so while I as well would welcome sort of a responsible China that contributes to the international order as we currently see it, I think once China has the ability to impact, not only conduct military operations, but use their military presence for political influence, I think that will be the time that U.S. policymakers will regret that they asked China or ever desired China to play a more active role in a lot of these issues in the Middle East, for example.